Welcome everyone. I realize that we will have audiences joining as we proceed, but can I just, my name is Patricia Daly. I'm Vice Principal at Jesus College, and welcome to the second in our series of webinars entitled What Really Matters. This forum was really established to enable us to have a series of conversation, primarily initially with school children and tutors as part of our Access program. And we are very grateful to our Access officer, Matt Williams, for organizing this event. Today we have a lineup of leading experts in finance, economics, geography, and sustainability to discuss under the title, Economy, Sustainability, and the Workplace in the Post-Pandemic World. Welcome. Please, as part of the protocols, can you turn off your video and your microphone? So the event will proceed as follows. I will get the panelists to introduce themselves briefly, then we'll address the first question, which is quite general, but addresses some of the sectors that the panelists have expertise in. And then we'll have discussions lasting perhaps about 45 minutes before I open up to questions and answers from the audience. So our experts are distinguished past and current fellows or students of the college, and they'll be speaking specifically to their areas of expertise. And last week, you might have noted that the International Monetary Fund predicted a decline of almost 5% in the global economic growth in 2020. We recognized, and I think the IMF also recognized, that there will be differential impacts across the globe. The UK's economy is expected to contract by 10% this year, and other countries are likely to fare much worse. There are concerns about how long this will last. Will the effects be similar to the 2008 financial crisis or as deep as the 1930s recession? Even before COVID, the economy was changing amidst the rise of nationalism and protectionist trade policies, as in Brexit. So how far can we expect the pre-COVID trends to intensify as firms and other organizations shed labor and mass unemployment returns? On the other hand, we may want to consider the opportunities that COVID might give us to do things differently, including changes in how we work or in relation to environmental sustainability. I'm going to start off now by getting the panelists to introduce themselves. And first, can I ask Professor Darek Wojcik to introduce himself?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, good evening, depending on where you're watching from. My name is Darek Wojcik. I'm a professor of economic geography at the School of Geography and the Environment and a fellow of St. Peter's College, Oxford. I also have the pleasure to chair the Global Network on Financial Geography, FinGeo. In the context of COVID-19, I'm most interested in how the pandemic has influenced and will influence the economic map of the world and the map of global finance.
Thank you. Now, Professor Stefan Durkin.
Oh, hi. So I'm Stefan Durkin. I'm a professor at the Graduate School of Government and also at the Economics Department and a fellow at Jesus. So I'm someone who works on developing countries. Until 2 years ago, I was the chief economist of DFID, the now defunct development ministry in the UK.
And our Professor Renee Adams.
Hi, I'm Renee Adams. I'm a professor of finance at Said Business School and a senior research fellow at Jesus College. I do a lot of work on corporate governance and also a lot of work on gender. So in the context of COVID, I'm interested in how corporations will balance the interests of stakeholders versus shareholders and also gender inequality.
Thank you. Tom Ilube.
Hi, I'm Tommy Lube. I'm a technology entrepreneur and educational philanthropist. I run a school in Africa and I run a cybersecurity company here. I'm also on the board of the BBC. I'm an honorary fellow of Jesus College and an advisory fellow of St Anne's College, Oxford. And my interest from a COVID point of view is its impact on innovation and entrepreneurialism, and its impact on education, particularly secondary education.
Thank you, Tom. And now Elizabeth Harnett.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm a lead researcher at the Oxford Sustainable Finance Programme, which is part of the Smith School for Enterprise and Environment in Oxford. I'm also a stipendiary lecturer in geography at Jesus College and was an undergraduate and postgraduate student there. My interest is in sustainable finance and how we promote a green recovery from COVID.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Now let's turn to our first question. Are there differences in how the impacts of the pandemic have been and will be experienced by social groups, economic sectors, or parts of the world? And we're going to start off with Darek Wojcik, who's going to address this question. Darek.
Thank you. So I'd like to start by restating what you mentioned already, Patricia, that the pandemic has had a hugely uneven impact on society and the world economy, and the recession, the ongoing recession, is most likely to deepen this variegation in terms of COVID-19 and its impacts. So socially, when we think about the cross-section of society, on average, those who had less and were therefore mostly more vulnerable have lost more, and they face bigger challenges moving forward. So think about the contrast between a waiter or a shop assistant on the one hand, who lost their jobs and may not be able to find a new one for a while, and a teacher or consultant or a lawyer who could keep working from home and whose jobs are typically not under threat going forward. So effectively, these income and wealth differences between places that have more jobs that can be done online and the places with fewer jobs that can be done online will increase. So for example, in the case of England, this may imply a bigger north-south divide. Now sectoral, there are huge differences, obviously, because there are sectors like energy, which suffered a lot because of falling commodity prices. On the other side, we have healthcare sector, pharmaceuticals in particular. We have software industry, from Zoom to esports. These companies can even thrive under these conditions, and especially in the near future. And again, this translates significantly into geographical differences. For example, Cambridge is a center of both software industry and pharmaceutical industry, and could do relatively well compared to many other parts of the UK. Now, there's an interesting pattern in terms of impacts if we look at financial market performance of companies. So it depends on size. So stock prices of smaller companies have suffered most, have declined most over the last months. Medium-sized companies suffered less, and the biggest companies suffered least. And this suggests that the pandemic may result in more corporate consolidation. So bigger companies swallowing smaller companies that are suffering. And this is a really worrying outcome with bad implications for inequality, again, because it's smaller cities, peripheral regions rely most on small and medium-sized enterprises. And benefits of big companies, big corporations tend to concentrate in big cities where these companies have headquarters, where they offer best jobs, and where they are owned and controlled from. Now, moving to the global level, there are further interesting observations one can make based on financial markets, what happened in financial markets in the last months. And this is partly based on work I did with Stefanos Ioannou in the School of Geography and the Environment, based on which we argue that the crisis, the pandemic, has highlighted the international hierarchy of financial power. So the international monetary hierarchy, with US in the dominant position and definitely subordinate position of emerging and particularly developing economies. So what was happening in March, in April, we saw everyone selling risky assets and flying to safety, which in practice meant mostly the US dollar. And most currencies lost value in relation to the US dollar. And it was also the US monetary and fiscal policy that arrested panic, that stopped panic in financial markets in late March, when a financial crisis was really around the corner. Interestingly, US stock market lost less value than markets in most other countries. And this shows that financial economic power of the US, despite what is seen as mishandling of public health policy response in the US, the power, particularly the financial power, is still there. In contrast, companies and currencies of developing countries lost most value since the start of the pandemic. Even before the pandemic even became widespread in these countries, these markets lost a lot of value, ironically. And why? Because they have been and are most vulnerable. They don't have strong currencies. They cannot get access to US dollars easily to shore up their economies. They have to rely on international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, which have responded to the pandemic, but and maybe even in unprecedented ways historically, but still on a much smaller scale than national financial institutions like central banks in the US, Japan, Europe, or the UK. So think, for example, that the total value of central bank interventions in all emerging and developing economies, so these are economies accounting for the majority of the world population, this total sum of bank intervention was comparable to the value of interventions by Bank of Japan alone, all right, in what is a shrinking and small, relatively, not top 3 economy in the world. Now, the financial hierarchy also matters in domestic scale. I don't know about people watching, but I haven't even used an ATM for months, let alone go to a bank branch. And this kind of change of behavior has implications. Yeah, if widespread, it means there is less need for bank branches. There are fewer financial sector, well-paying financial sector jobs, fewer jobs in related professions like law and accountancy, because these transactions often, require bankers, lawyers, accountants at the same time. And gradually, a city like Oxford may become a less important center of financial intermediation and related services. So what I expect then is acceleration of a branch network trimming by banks in the financial sector. And this, again, would hit smaller cities and towns more than big cities and financial centers. And it's another way how the pandemic can contribute to more uneven distribution of income and wealth. So when we think about the beginning of 2020, the biggest socioeconomic problem we entered the year with was, putting environmental sustainability aside for now, it was inequality by far that led to all kinds of political problems. And the irony and tragedy is that the pandemic has most likely deepened these existing inequalities across society, between and within countries. We don't have hard numbers on inequality yet, but it's quite symptomatic that the stock markets have recovered well despite rising unemployment. Billionaires owning big tech companies are dozens of billions of dollars richer than they were only 3 months ago. I think these numbers are symptomatic of what has happened in the underlying economy. So what should be the policy response? Well, obviously policy responses have to support the vulnerable. They have tried to do that in some countries. I don't think they have gone far enough. Future development policies have to take income and wealth redistribution more seriously. It's not just a question of creating opportunities. I think it's a question of redistribution. But this is challenging, obviously, when global economic governance is becoming more fragmented due to populism, nationalism that you mentioned, Patricia, a bit due to tensions between US and China because of Brexit and threats undermining the future of the European Union. So when countries cooperate less and less with each other, it's more difficult, for example, to tackle such big problems as tax avoidance and evasion, which undermine development all over the world. So the last thing I would like to say is that crises tend to happen in sequences. So when we go back to 2008, it started with a financial crisis. It started in financial markets. We remember the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008. Then the financial crisis became an economic crisis. Then the economic crisis became a social crisis, partly in this country and many others due to austerity, also in the EU. Also became partly actually a health crisis, which few people realize, because life expectancy in some sections of the UK population has actually declined in the last decade. Again, I would argue partly due to response to the 2008 crisis and austerity and cuts in the healthcare, in public healthcare and other areas of the welfare state. Now the order is different. We are starting obviously with a health crisis. It's already becoming an economic crisis, recessions. It may yet become a financial crisis. I mean, the first threat of a financial crisis was averted in March, mostly because of the US government actions, monetary and fiscal policy. But it may yet become, due to a pile of bad debt growing, may become a financial crisis. And later, it may turn into a social and political crisis. I think we still have time to stop this chain, this catastrophic chain reaction. And what is also illustrates this chain of crises and a sequence is that the economic problems are extremely complex that we're facing, because they not only economic, they political, environmental, geographical, social, psychological. It's about behavior. So we definitely need interdisciplinary conversations like this one and collaborations to tackle these challenges.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you indeed. You've really touched on a lot of issues that of concern to us, particularly the differential impact, the fact that some economies were having difficulties even before the crisis, but there was actually some growth in parts of the developing world and in emerging economies, particularly in the African region, where growth rates were, I suppose, around 2 or 3% per annum, but if not higher. Let's turn now to Stefan Durkin, who's going to talk about the impact in the developing world.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. So to pick up, where Darius, I'm not saying totally left it, but somewhere in the middle, was also touching upon this kind of global geographical disparity in the way the crisis may well be impacting on firms. I'll briefly talk about, a bit of the overall impact and also how it then feeds back onto people's lives in the developing world. And as you said, Patricia, actually, things were not going too badly in a large number of developing countries. We go through a period of a few decades where extreme poverty has been declining at unprecedented rates. And yes, there were definitely a number of countries where very little change was happening, but quite a lot of them. Actually, there was quite a lot of progress, not least in Africa. There were typically 5-6 of the fast growing countries out of the top 10 fast growing countries were in Africa. Ethiopia was the fastest growing economy of the last decade, more or less, in the world. Now, the crisis hits, and in many ways, the economic crisis hit Africa well before the disease hit it. Even if you look today at the numbers, the incidence of the disease, and this is not just with testing, well, because of limited testing, the incidence seems to be lower. In fact, WHO Africa is making remarkably optimistic predictions for the spread of the disease up to the end of this year. The economic impact, though, was dramatic. First China being hit, where that's become the most important trading partner for Africa, and in fact for many, many developing countries. And then now the cumulative effects of now also all the Western economies to be so strongly affected is in the form of remittances, in the form of tourism that had become important, in the form of course, commodities. Many countries were totally dependent on commodity exports and prices were just collapsing. But also then other countries that had begun to break through in international value chain for, say, light manufacturing. Think of Bangladesh. 90% of export is garments. You know, we may worry about all the about some of these industries, but they were crucially important for this country, including for poverty and for access for women, for good, for better employment. All these things have come to a halt. So the macroeconomic shocks in these countries is actually in many ways quite unprecedented. Even in the 1980s, that I am one of the people on the call that still remembers these the crisis in the African continent. Actually, the scale of this is probably much deeper at this moment. And so the disease is spreading. The health consequences seem to be relatively modest at the moment, but it's just the economies have come to a halt. Now, if you do this in an economy like the UK, we've seen the dramatic impacts that it can have. But we have a state that can function, that can act. If you come to African countries with low capabilities, but also with a really precarious finance situation, many of these countries started already with high indebtedness, and their access to international financial markets is quite limited. There was very little they can do. And in fact, on top of this, even if there's the macro shock, there is the micro impact, where in the UK or in rich economies, we can do furloughing and other ways of the state stepping in. If essentially 90% of your population is working informally or self-employed, whether it's in agriculture, in informal sector, in urban areas, there's very little you can do. And that's what we saw. We saw actually exemplary public health policies in many countries where economies were closed down, locked down, acted upon, and that's across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. But still, huge impacts on populations. I was involved a little bit at the tail end of Ebola in West Africa and seeing how this works through and how the impacts are for poverty. Very strikingly, you get very similar things that happen there. It's informal workers in the urban centers, usually people that actually are upwardly mobile, having migrated from the countryside, already getting a bit of a better life, they actually are strongly affected. And that's a big group in these countries that's an extremely vulnerable. And then finally, one of the things that we're observing in Western economies at the moment, you know, Bank of England actually has some cautiously optimistic notes of the scale of recovery. American figures, you know, the job figures are bad, but they're not as bad as we thought they were. There's recovery that's faster. In rich economies, we seem to be getting to this possible pattern of a V-shaped, or at least not a total L-shaped or ever going down type of letter in terms of the economy. An L-shaped was after the financial crisis. I'm actually quite optimistic for rich economies that it's not going to be an L, but actually a little bit more like a strangely written V with a small ascent afterwards, but coming back and actually recovering quite well. In developing countries, I'm much more pessimistic because there it's going to be much larger. It's going to take much longer that many of the things that they were based on is going to recover. Capital has flown back. Darius was mentioning it. It's the capital flight is actually being very strikingly in Africa. Projects that were going to be started have been stopped, but capital is flowing very rapidly out of these kind of emerging markets and poorer economies. Think of what tourism will do. When will it recover? Commodity pricing, similarly, it's going to take some time. So it's going to be harder, and at the same time for very poor people, who are typically already much more in a low asset position with a state that doesn't really function in the way to do it, I'm much more worried that their actually current poverty may well lead to persistent poverty. And in fact, even though I've been surprised how many countries in the world, in the developing world, have instituted social protection schemes, it proved in practice very hard to reach these kind of groups who are not quite connected to existing schemes. So kind of middle groups can be protected, but an awful lot of these kind of groups, things what happened to migrants in India, are not quite getting there. So I fear that in that sense, both at the domestic level and at the macro level, the recovery may well be a bit harder. Very quickly on responses. Meanwhile, aid flows are going down dramatically. We're going to get humanitarian needs going up. These resources are not there. World Bank, IMF is bringing resources to the table more than ever. It's not entirely clear whether actually there's going to be enough bandwidth in richer economies to actually even focus to make sure that the right things are being done relative to these places. But that's something we'll live with probably for the next decade in these places. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. You'll get an opportunity to come back. Please, can we keep our comments short because so that everyone can speak and we have time to address some of the other questions. Okay, we're going to turn to Tom now, who's in the IT sector.
Okay, thank you. Actually, in response to this particular question, differences, I just wanted to build on Stefan's observations, perhaps at a more a hands-on level, because obviously I run a school in Ghana, and I'm also involved in education here. So I've seen firsthand some of the differences. So with our school in Ghana, with students all over Africa, when the crisis hit, we had to send all the girls home, and similarly, people have been home here and trying to engage with their schools. The key difference has been, I think, the social impact of that, and that's what really stood out for us. When we send our girls home and we say, stay in touch with us and we'll teach you remotely as we work through this, it turns out that when they go home, they have to be the young women at home again. So all of a sudden, they're burdened with the cooking and the cleaning and the looking after the young ones and the going to the market, even though there's supposed to be a lockdown and so forth. So we're trying to reach them and we're trying to say, stay in touch with your education. And they're saying, my father or my mother is telling me to do this, that, and the other. And we realize that as a school, when they're with us, that we're playing a much more sort of protective role. We're lifting them out of that environment so that they can learn for a while, unencumbered by all of these other pressures. And I think that we're underestimating the impact of that. And that sort of really, so on the surface, it's the same. School closed down, students go home, students try and learn remotely. But the difference in practice, because of the social pressures in these different places, is really extremely marked. And then you overlay on that the technology challenges. We send our girls home, and they have phones and so forth, so that they can stay in touch. But then they can't charge the phones because the electricity is off. So they can't engage with the lesson because their phone is uncharged, and now they're locked down, so they can't walk to the charging place to get it charged again. So I sometimes hear people talk about, remote learning. That's the solution to a lot of Africa's education problems and so forth. But I think that's often by people who've never actually run a school in Africa and don't know what it's really like. And as was said, when various countries, my father was from Nigeria. I lived there for a while. I know a lot of people there. When the government tried to close Lagos down for a few days, I mean, Lagos is a city with somewhere between 17 and 21 million people, is that sort of order of magnitude. 66% of it, there's extreme wealth, but there is also extreme poverty. 66% of it may be classified as slums. You've got parts of whole bits of it that are on stilts and so forth, and then you've got extremely wealthy parts as well. That a city like that just can't be locked down in the way that we can lock down London. People were saying, look, if you lock me down for 2 weeks, I'll starve. So I can either have the virus in 3 months' time, or I can starve tomorrow. Well, I'm going back out again. So I think the social implications and impacts of some of what might look like the same policies result in profoundly different outcomes in these different places. It's probably all I'll say at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I think these social inequalities and the social effects are also visible here in the UK, where with a lot of the frontline workers who had no choice really but to go to work. Can we now turn to Professor Renee Adams to address the question?
Yes, thank you for inviting me. I guess I'll pick up on Tom's point about social inequality. So, in particular, also because Tom was talking about the girls going to school. So I study gender, and there's a lot going on right now in terms of differential, or people speculating about the differential impact of the pandemic on women versus men. And it's interesting because, so I think it's pretty clear that, now everyone has carers' responsibilities, right? And so I think it's clear that women shoulder a greater burden as a result of the increased carers' responsibilities. Also, women's unemployment is higher. But at the same time, people argue that, well, maybe, this will be a good thing, the pandemic, because it'll be a shock to gender norms, right? So, so maybe, and also now everyone's doing flex work, so it should be easier to work flexibly now, and there won't be a stigma associated with working flexibly anymore. So it could go both ways, right? So either it's going to be a good outcome for women or not. I have to say I'm more on the pessimistic side. So I think that gender norms aren't changing as much as people are saying that they're changing. I also don't observe much sort of informed discussion of these issues. If you look, even something simple as people trying to figure out why some countries that are led by women are doing better than countries led by men. If you look at the discussion in the media on this issue, it's like the tone of surprise is always sort of astounding to me, right? And I'm like, well, why are people surprised that women are able to lead their countries effectively? Also issues about the differential death rate for men and women due to COVID. The first reaction is always, it's a biological difference between men and women. In my own research, I show there's social differences that cause these things. So, so I guess I'll end there. I'll just say that, I think it's super important that going forward, I think pretty much a lot of the fights for diversity have stopped. And I think it's super important that they continue because, we need to leverage the talent of the entire population. We can't have this increasing social inequality. Now, how to do it, I think, is very challenging. I don't have any good answers. So I think this is, that's why a forum like this is great, where we can discuss these things. So thanks.
Thank you, Renee. Elizabeth, do you want to comment, Elizabeth Harnett, on this question?
Yeah, thanks. And maybe I'll jump straight into some of the policy options that are available to reduce some of these disparities that my fellow panelists have talked about. And I think one of the things that I am really encouraged by is the fact that the measures needed to overcome some of the social and economic challenges of our time, and specifically from the pandemic, are also the same ones that are needed to overcome climate change and meet sustainable development goals. You've kind of got these systemic inequalities that we've been talking about before, and actually they're going to be the same inequalities that are also going to drive disproportionate experiences of climate change and economic growth going forward. So I think that the opportunity now to jumpstart economies is a huge opportunity also to jumpstart efforts towards the social and sustainable development goals. And I think that one of the key opportunities for doing this is related to the rise in unemployment and the fact that actually it's the young people that have been most disproportionately affected by this rise in unemployment, that actually, and furloughing as well. You can actually see that as the gig economy and the informal economy and even the services economy to an extent has been affected, that actually these young people might be ripe for education and retraining programs along the lines of a just transition, which is something that we talk about a lot in sustainability language, of trying to create a transition towards a low carbon economy that also protects the social well-being and welfare of different groups in society. And this can be applied globally, both in developed and developing countries. So I think this opportunity for re-education, retraining of these young people into green growth jobs, whatever they might look like, there's a whole variety of them. I think that that's a really great opportunity. And I'll talk more about perhaps later around whether this is actually happening, but I think just the opportunities for kind of quick, bold action are there, and that actually there's a lot of policy levers that can be used. I think one word I've cautioned that I just maybe start with before we build on this going forward is that kind of Boris Johnson's build 20 kind of announcements in the last week, it didn't come with as much focus on building sustainably as we'd liked. But actually last year we saw that the UK government was taken to court against the Heathrow expansion, and that was deemed illegal because it was contradictory to the 2050 net zero target goals. So we actually have a lot of backstops in place. We just need to make sure that society, the courts and other policymakers keep our governments accountable for driving this growth in a sustainable and socially equitable and environmentally supportive way. So maybe I'll stop there and we can talk more as we go through the other questions.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. I mean, obviously, most of you have touched on these huge disparities that were there and might have been aggravated by the COVID pandemic. But I just want to ask the question really, in what can be done in terms of, Lizzie mentioned some, but are there other, opportunities here? What can be done to help these affected parts of the world to recover? Who'd like to speak? Derek, would you like to come in again? Or... Your mic is off.
No, I would be happy to hear more about the just transition later from Elizabeth. Which I absolutely subscribe to. But again, I would like to return to this concern about the lack and deficit of multilateral governance now in the world, and this multilateral governance being in crisis as a threat to this, because even if national responses embrace just transition, we need international coordination here. For example, from the perspective of financial markets, we need to address, as I mentioned, tax avoidance and evasion. Otherwise, we're still facing the problem of regulatory arbitrage. And in this country in particular, there is the threat that after Brexit, it may move towards more of a kind of a tax haven policy for corporations and for the wealthy. Having orchestrated and facilitated tax avoidance and evasion all over the world, now the country may become more of a tax haven itself. So I really hope this doesn't happen. So we need leadership, and the crisis has demonstrated the power of the nation state. But I hope there is an international response that could be orchestrated to address this issue of just transition.
Thanks, Stefan. Obviously, you've been interacting for a long time with international institutions. What have you got to say?
No, there is the point, first of all, is saying there's so much less international cooperation at this moment than we either need, but also that there should have been. I mean, we do know that there is a set of forces that came together, and types of governments in a number of countries in the world, including in not just US or BRICS economies and so on, that actually are all of them somehow coming together and not quite inclined to do it. Now, we also know that this came in a political space. This came faster than many of us had actually foreseen. So I'm actually always an optimist that it can go faster away than we sometimes observe. And it's in that sense that the opportunity of that will come after it is kind of a, not maybe today, but maybe in 6 months and in 12 months, a bit more reflection of what can be done. There are opportunities there, I think, that we shouldn't underestimate. I'm, however, a little bit less optimistic that it will all turn into a very long horizon of green type of recoveries. I think we are a little bit optimistic that we very quickly can mix these agendas. If I look at it, what the urgency will be, will be built back quickly rather than build back better. And there is a real push there to get economies going, and I would look around across the developing world as well, who are important partners in building that greener world. Their economies have been decimated, and they will not be able to be able to easily respond and say, okay, let's now take a 10-15 year horizon. And I think that's the caution I have.
Yes, anyone else want to comment before? I mean, Elizabeth, obviously, Stefan's finished by saying, environmental sustainability is not likely to be on the agenda for some time, or at least taken very seriously. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think I probably share Stefan's cautionary tale, and I think that we're seeing a divide globally between those countries that are really trying to show climate leadership at this time and those that are focused just on building back as quickly as possible. And I'm afraid that the UK is certainly falling into that latter category. I think that some countries are thinking about this. So, for example, in France, Canada, and I think in the Netherlands, they introduced government bailouts for airlines that were actually tied to future carbon emissions drops per passenger CO2 emissions. So that kind of initiative was welcome. But actually, a survey of finance ministers and central bankers undertaken across multiple different countries, developing and developed, by Professor Cameron Hepburn, who leads the Smith School, and Joseph Stiglitz and Nick Stern, who are very kind of prominent economists, studied the likely COVID recovery packages and actually found that if we want to promote both COVID recovery and sustainable recovery, bailouts for airlines were the least successful policies going forward. And actually, the way that we need to focus was on liquidity for households and small and medium enterprises, because they're the ones that have been affected most and will be affected most going forward, and are the underpinnings really of every economy. But also this clean energy infrastructure is very much needed to drive both job creation, because there's a lot of opportunity in construction and infrastructure development, but also this shift towards a low carbon future that is possible, but is definitely needed now. If we lock in further high emissions infrastructure based on the need just to recover as quickly as possible, anything that's built now will still be having an impact in carbon terms in 2050, at which point we know that change in these systems will be too late to avoid the worst of climate change. So I think that there's certainly cautionary tales to be told, and there's not as much sustainable narratives as we thought there would be, or we hope that there would be, but there's certainly opportunities there if they're taken.
Thank you. Yes.
Can I say something about the entrepreneurial landscape and possible contributions from that side? And I don't think in any way that's the solution, but it's just a factor. Entrepreneurs quite like chaos, and therefore, if you are an entrepreneur like me, from a business point of view, you don't mind this environment too much. You see all of this chaos and change going on, and you think about, are there opportunities there? And it's not dissimilar. I was saying to my folk in my company, the level of impact on businesses today is not dissimilar to what dot-com businesses faced in around 2000. That was obviously much more localized. But if you were running one of those companies at that time, the impact is pretty much the same. I was running a company at the time. We had 100 people, and about 4 months later, we had 20 people, and company after company was going out of business in that particular sector. But what you also found was a whole other generation of companies that emerged literally around that time. So, Wikipedia launched in 2001, Skype in 2003, Facebook 2004, Netflix launched a little bit earlier, but in 2003, shortly after and around the time of the dot-com crash, it had maybe 1 million subscribers. Now it has 182 million. So there will be a wave of entrepreneurial companies that emerge out of this mess that we're in at the moment. And I think one thing that I don't see governments looking at, I see their policies trying to shore up and support existing companies. This will keep you going through this period. I don't see, and I think there could be more imagination about policies that would encourage entrepreneurs to come back again and try and do new things and try and unlock. They could take some of the schemes like the EIS scheme and so forth that are quite generous and attractive schemes for investors in early stage companies, and make those for a period significantly more generous and attractive and suddenly find that they had unlocked another $500 million or $1 billion of private money to go into a wave of startup companies. So I think looking at how this chaotic period can be leveraged by entrepreneurs and innovators is an interesting area to explore.
And directing, obviously, as you say, funding to small and medium-sized companies that are probably the most affected by, will be the most affected by the pandemic, you know, according to Derek.
I think, yes, I think that's right. But allowing those that aren't that, don't just use it to keep everyone going. Some of these companies will just have to fail in this period, but the entrepreneurs that run them will be back again in 3 or 6 months' time, because that's who they are.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Oh, Stefan. Your mic is off.
Yep, sorry.
It's on.
I'm sorry, Renee, I won't take long. I know you were just at the same time coming in, but I want to pick up on what Tom said. I mean, you know, one of the things, and I think Darius referred to it a little bit, you know, this whole, you know, as economists, we like to refer to it as this Schumpeterian type of thing, you know, the creative destruction from at the tail. We, of course, have, and typically policymakers are attracted by the tail rather than actually trying to promote the emergence of a new front. And it's what you refer to. And it's this real balance, because for once in this whole period, while normally in recessions, however cruel it may seem, it's the bad firms that get weeded out. The problem, of course, with this particular crisis is it's not necessarily the least dynamic firms that necessarily got killed off, you know, and it's this kind of thing. So policymaking is much harder here. But I have one other comment of optimism on the sustainability side, and it links a little bit to that as well. I think if there's one thing we're all learning, and this way of communicating is an example of it, is that an awful lot of things can be done without having an urbanization that is focused on getting all kinds of people to come together in a particular thing, not to get an infrastructure that is focused entirely on trying to capture agglomeration effects from heavy concentration, but that we can do much more dispersed things. I actually, even for developing countries, this gives hope for the nature of their urbanization, because one of the things that I think, if I'm an entrepreneur in India or maybe in Africa, I would be totally ready to actually start thinking about what services can I provide digitally to the rich economies, where they will be far more expensive than any of the technicians that are with all the university graduates. And I have a bit of an optimism that for the first time in a globalized economy, there may be a possibility for white-collar jobs to be created in poorer places that actually would be good quality jobs that can actually be providing it. And so both of these things, you know, not depending on all the movement of people, different type of infrastructure and urbanization, that would all be good for the green economy. And so that gives me quite a lot of hope.
Thank you. Thank you. We do have a question in the chat, but I'm going to take the audience questions later. Obviously, I mean, what you're talking about really is change also in the workplace. And we have a question about how the workplace will change as a result of these developments. So you're saying more white-collar jobs in the global south, that's an opportunity. Would anyone like to comment? Renee, I think you had your hands up, although I couldn't, yeah. Okay,
yeah, actually, I just want to, not specifically to that point, but since we were talking about what needs to be done going forward, I just wanted to stress that, you know, it's not just about the policy making. I also think it's really important that we continue the research. And I think one thing the pandemic has really highlighted is the importance, especially in the health arena, how important it was to have sort of solid research backing the policies, right? And so I think, you know, evidence-based policies are presumably the best types of policies. And, you know, if we want to address inequality, first we need to understand the problem, we need to measure the problem, we need to be able to track progress, and all of that requires sort of expertise, measurement, you know, research. And so I just want to, you know, make that point that research is also very important.
Thank you. And I think, yes, Tom.
Yeah, I was going to comment on how workplace will change. I think there are two things there for me. One is that to sort of distinguish between remote working and a distributed workplace. So I think what we're seeing and what we have at the moment is a huge amount of remote working, but it's almost described as that, and there's still the sort of feeling that the company has a center of gravity, and now we're distributed. And running that as a company is different to saying we are a distributed company, i.e. there isn't a center of gravity. There is no place that you are supposed to be. Where you work is where you want to work, where you do your best work. And that requires a different style of management and incentive, and in particular, trust is different in that environment. You have to, as a manager, as a leader, you have to change the way that you trust your workforce. And I think people are talking about, will we go back to the offices or will we stay remote working and so forth? I think that there will be quite a lot of going back to the office, but I think for those companies that try and not go back to the office, the challenge for them is whether they manage to shift their mindsets into, we are now a distributed company. And I think in that there's a technique, and there are various techniques, but there's a technique called results-oriented work environment, where you shift your style of management purely to outcomes. You become completely disinterested in how many hours your employees work or what time periods they work in or where they work. You're only interested in what the outcome is. And I think that organizations will have to learn techniques like that in order to really embrace this distributed work model. And I think that's where the prize is, if we manage to change workplaces like that.
Thank you, Tom. Derek has his hand up. And then Lizzie. Derek.
Just two short comments to add on the workplace changes on a macro and on a micro level. On a macro level, one concern or challenge to address is that the pandemic may be accelerating the replacement of labor with technology and capital. So acceleration of AI, artificial intelligence, and robotization, because with the threat of this pandemic and future pandemics, labor becomes, with all the regulations in terms of health and safety, becomes more expensive and tricky and more difficult to deal with. So this could potentially lead to issues of more long-term chronic unemployment, both in the global north and the global south. So we'll see how this pans out. And on a micro level, somewhat in relation to what Tom was saying, and I think in relation to René's research, I think we should watch a potential shift in power relations within companies, within firms and organizations, because online work involves a different power dynamic. I think power tends to shift in favor of those with power, management and executives. I mean, it's easier to mute people on Zoom than on the factory floor or in an office with 200 with a manager facing 200 workers. So I think labor will have to kind of respond with some ways to make itself less vulnerable to both automation, robotization, and these shifting power relations in an online work environment.
Thank you. That's a very important point. Lizzie, before I...
Yeah, just quickly, I think that broadly, I'd say it will depend on the type of organization and the workplace that everyone works in. But I think that trying to link this back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, that actually working from home and remote working definitely seems to be increasing inequality. You've got those people who actually say that they really enjoy working from home, probably because they have access to good internet, probably have their own workspace, their own offices, and probably a garden or something to, some open space to go and enjoy the evenings that they're no longer commuting home to. Whereas actually for those that are in lower income sectors and doing more service jobs, perhaps they can't work from home. It's not an option. Or if they are, then they're working from studio flats with very little opportunity for kind of rest and respite from work. So I think actually that this is likely to actually drive further inequality. But I think it was interesting that actually there was a McKinsey study that came out this month that said 80% of people actually enjoyed working from home, and 41% said that they were more productive. So I think it will actually drive a questioning of whether we need the same types and the same number of offices. And I think until we have a vaccine, actually large in-person meetings, academic conferences, for example, just aren't going to be practical. And I think we'll have to adapt to this new normal for longer than we maybe expect.
Yeah, and there will be reverberations in the economy, especially with regards to academic conferences. All those large hotels make their income from these conferences will have to earn elsewhere. Yes, we have, obviously we have a question specifically about the UK's economy, and there might obviously be listeners who are interested in what's likely to happen here. I think there's a sense that the UK's economy will rebound, but might rebound differently, and it will depend on obviously policy, having the right policies in place. I wonder if anyone wants to comment on that before we move on to the final question. I know you're not, Stefan?
No, it just,
sorry, yeah, your mic.
Yeah. Just a minor, it's an addition actually to what Lizzie was already saying, I think, is that, the real challenge is clearly the rebounding, typically because of the forces that others have described, is this risk for the lower income side. And, a bit like similar what was the, if we were to want to give a course to why populism has been rising in certain Western countries, the same processes that were happening in the technology replacement of labor through these things. But the interesting dynamic in the UK is that whatever we may say about government policy, there is definitely an objective there, and definitely more flows of trying to do forms of rebalancing. So I think it's going to be very interesting whether the policy mechanisms, and we can all look skeptical or not, but whether that actually there is going to be something there that will play out. And it will be interesting to see, because we usually don't have it after a recession where these groups are at risk, that it seems to be a policy objective to really buffer them. So I think it's quite interesting. The final little thing as well I want to add is to, where we probably are right in saying that the inequality within the UK may increase, it's the same processes that may actually reduce between country inequality, just as happened with the earlier phases of globalization, where low-income jobs actually move to places where they will be performed by higher qualified people remotely, and you won't do it in your own economy. So you're going to get potentially all kinds of shifts, and it's going to be, going back to the point of research, really interesting in 10 years to start mapping some of these patterns.
Thank you. Lizzie, I'm not sure if that's a new hand. I forgot.
Yeah, I'll come in briefly and maybe just talk to something that we haven't really mentioned, but is maybe an elephant in the room, and that's Brexit. I'm certainly not an expert, but I have a feeling that COVID it's certainly lowered the profile of Brexit in the media, but that perhaps also means that it's a lower priority in policy fields as well. And actually, I feel like this might create a harder Brexit than might have otherwise happened. And actually that growing red tape will delay any kind of economic rebound that the UK might enjoy as Brexit starts to take effect towards the end of this year and early next year. So I think that that's maybe just one small point to add.
Thank you. I mean, one of the final question about was, will a global recession change thinking about free market approaches to the economy? We have seen investments in the economy in a quantitative easing, which obviously is not new, talk of a New Deal. Are you any views on whether this will signify major change? I mean, obviously greater public ownership is a possibility. Stefan.
Yeah, so I actually think it's not that really is going to change the thinking. The thinking, it's been for a while now that anyone definitely working around global economy and so on, as even IMF has 10 years ago brought out working papers saying inequality is not very good for economic growth and all these things. It's not the thinking, it's the action. Actually, we create an opportunity to act on it. It's the thinking is there. There's been enough scholarly input to getting a good sense of that, markets will fail, that states, institutions matter, that they need to find a good mix. but it's an opportunity for action, and I think a more easy consensus around that without naive, different political views and ideologies that supposedly are against it. So I think I'm quite hopeful on that.
Thank you. Any further comments? I'm going to open up soon to the audience questions. We've got a couple in the chat. If you are listening and if you would like to speak, you can also raise your hand in the chat and ask a question, or you can write. We have one question from Angela Jackson. Angela, do you want to ask the question? If you could turn on your video and your mic. If not, I will just read
hang on a minute, just a second. Just hearing the comments about taking the opportunity to build a sustainable recovery, I wondered what the panel think about the requests that we're hearing for government support for the airline industry. And I don't know how much of that support has been given, but what does the panel think of that sort of immediate reaction?
You had another question, and Angela, would you like to ask
that?
Oh, yeah. And then we'll just answer both together.
This is my pet subject, thinking about the university and the buildings, the way they've evolved historically. Does the university now need a really new large space to plan, designing for the new era of social distance? Could Oxford be in a position to do that?
Okay, we'll start. Thank you for your question. And if you could turn your video and mute your mic. And Elizabeth, you've commented on this previously. Would you like to say something about the airline industry?
Yeah, so I would do. I think that, yes, there have been bailouts of airlines in the UK and around the world. And I'm not necessarily entirely opposed to them because they do provide a lot of jobs and they do provide a lot of opportunities for international trade. So a world without the leading airlines would likely be a poorer one and not necessarily more socially just. But I would comment that the best policies seem to be the ones that try and link these to some kind of sustainable agenda within the companies. In Air France, for example, having to reduce their carbon emissions per passenger by half by 2030 or have a higher interest rate. I think that's a really great policy. And maybe, so I think that there's definitely ways in which that can be done better.
Thank you, Lizzie. The issue around the university, obviously, the question around whether the university needs larger spaces. I mean, I was reading recently about whether companies do need larger spaces because there was a trend towards open plan offices. Will that still be, Tom, do you think companies will still create open plan offices, or will they move back and shift to a mixture of home working and much more,
I think this is a fairly profound moment for companies. I think the physical workspace is an important factor, and we're thinking about it. Every chief executive I know is thinking about their office space. And a year ago I was thinking I'm going to need to take more office space because we're expanding out of our building. Now I'm thinking we probably don't need to renew our lease, or if we do, then we'll argue it down because we just don't need we don't need the space and we're going to go distributed. But I think it's sort of a proxy for thinking about what a company is in a more fundamental way. And I think that may apply to universities as well. If I think about myself as a distributed company, if I was restarting my company now, I might be thinking, well, do I need an accounting department? I'll get someone to do that. Do I need salespeople? Well, you can always have third-party salespeople. You could go through almost every aspect of what my company does and find a third party working in a distributed way willing to do it for me. So it sort of raises the question of, could I be a a large-scale one-person company. I sort of wonder when we'll get to the point where we'll see the first billion-pound valuation company that actually just consists of one person. And I think that we might see some similar sort of questioning going on the university side. Is it actually necessary for the thing we call a university to be several thousands of people all coming together to a physical space? So I'll ask the university people what they think about that. I'd be interested in what René thinks.
I'm not involved in administration at the moment, that level. Richard Moxon has a question, and Richard, if you want, let me know if you would like to speak. You could unmute and turn on your video and ask it. It's a comment about the consequences of the pandemic on global immunization.
Yeah, I'm just trying to unmute right now. It says I can't unmute my video because the host has disabled it. But
oh, okay. Well, don't worry. We can hear you.
Yes, good. Well,
yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Okay.
Sorry. The pandemic has emphasized enormously the need for global cooperation. We're in this together. And perhaps I've heard less about whether the pandemic is going to change attitudes so that essentially there is more cohesion, more cooperation. And I bring that up in the context of immunization. One of the great success stories in the past decades through the extended program for immunization and Gavi has been getting vaccines to all of the world. And it's about to become unstitched because we're facing a crisis as a result of the COVID pandemic, whereby the immunization infrastructure that has been set up is going to reel backwards, and maybe we'll lose on measles and polio and diphtheria and whooping cough what we've gained over the last 20 years. So there's a lot of expertise both in developing world and in the differential impact of this pandemic. And I think that's a really, the immunization is a really concrete example of how this pandemic is going to essentially have some very deleterious effects, which will be both economic as well, because vaccines are not just humanitarian, they're also wealth creating.
Thank you, Richard. Stefan, would you like to comment about this, since you might, the global?
No, it's
I mean, you're not a WHO expert, but at least, yeah.
No, it's an excellent question, and definitely my time had differed. But actually, in the last few months, I've been very involved with on the Whitehall side related to the Oxford vaccine. Actually, so it's an interesting thing because the you're absolutely right. There are risks. There's both risks we could foresee in February that a vaccine war was very likely. And actually, quite a lot of, there's been more effort internationally than I'd expected behind the scenes to try to minimize this kind of outcome. If I had 2 months ago, I was far more pessimistic about the whole story around immunization and vaccination than actually I'm now. I mean, even, the vaccine that Oxford is involved in with AstraZeneca, there are already deals made even before the efficacy is being proven, that actually there are deals available for vaccines to be delivered to developing countries, which is unique in this kind of setup. Normally, you would expect every order, as it happened with the drug involved, that the Americans would just buy it all up. And so, it's not as bad. In fact, I am slightly optimistic that actually it's around the vaccines that we may find the beginnings of sowing the seeds of better global cooperation when we come out of it. Because it's not a perfect story, but it's not the worst story. It's definitely not a story that I feared we would have in 2 months. But it's the right entry point because people understand now what the importance of a vaccine, or hopefully in the autumn, if we have one, then they will fully understand what the change it can give. And to actually give a boost of this kind of more simple, very direct ways of global cooperation to sow the seed on much more complex things like climate change that are far more complex negotiations to actually rebuild a bit of global cooperation.
Thanks, that's very optimistic. And yeah, we now have a question from Adrian Clarke. Adrian, would you like to turn on your video and microphone?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful, fantastic. Really enjoying the discussion, and I'm learning so much, and I love that. My question really is born out of the fact that I've been listening to this conversation, and it's not in my nature to ever be pessimistic, those who know me. But I must say there's a hint of pessimism in as much as that one of the themes that all the speakers are talking about is obviously equality.
Oh,
and it would appear that most of the speakers seem to think that inequality is going to grow. My question really is that the initial social cohesion exemplified by Thursday's NHS clap, when we all came out, I think at 8 o'clock. I mean, is that something of a mirage? This, where doctors will stand next to dustmen, and dustmen will stand next to cleaners, and cleaners next to entrepreneurs like Tom and all the rest of it. And is it something now where we have to say that all the rhetoric from Johnson, the sort of, not to build, but, we're going to level up. Is this something of a past now? Is this something that we must consign to almost like, as it were, is it poetry? We electioneering in poetry, but we govern in prose. I think that's the quote, if I'm misquoting it. Because it makes me wonder, given that we're already the most unequal country, I think, in Western, certainly in Europe, right? So have I got to look forward to now to more inequality? Because I think that is somewhat detrimental to social cohesion. And I'm just wondering what the panel thinks about that, is that the memory of us all standing together, 8 o'clock, using the Tony Blair Bush expression, shoulders to shoulder, cheek and jowl. That is all gone now. And we must go back to almost Edwardian Britain, where the greatest thing that determines social outcomes is your parents' birth. Is that the society that I've got to look forward to now? I mean, what does the panel think about that in my initial observation?
Who would like to?
I'm happy to jump in and
okay, and then Derek, did you also want to speak after? Yeah, so Lizzie.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that I took away from what's happened so far is that society has actually shown that it does have the will and ability to fundamentally change its expectations and its practices in a very short space of time when we feel that we're working towards a necessary goal. And I think that actually we have this opportunity now to take what we see as both in our self-interest and in the interest of the rest of the country and change for the better. Whether we have necessarily the right politicians in power to drive that in the UK and around the world, I have less, optimism or, confidence. But I think that there has to be, as a result of COVID, more critique of some of the social policies and maybe a more critique of the free market and the role of businesses in that. And, policies such as the lack of sick pay in the US have been shown to be, really not good enough for a time of pandemic. So whether it drives kind of questions around that, but I think it's also, this inequality has driven more questions around gender inequality, although, Renee was saying that not as much as we would like, but also especially around the Black Lives Matter movement, that actually there's come to a point where the inequality made clear in the pandemic is so stark that actually people are willing to take to the streets and demand better. And I think that actually that's a trend that we should see continuing.
Thanks, Lizzie. Derek.
So this makes me think when you talk about people stopping to clap for NHS makes me obviously think about the Prime Minister suggesting that we should be clapping for bankers, which was then kind of explained as, you know, don't expect any hikes in tax rates for the top earners. And I just hope personally it's not a kind of sign of things to come in terms of turning Britain into more tax evasion, tax avoidance friendly jurisdiction. Obviously, I see a big role for the financial and professional services industry in this country. Don't get me wrong. I think this is a major competitive advantage here. One contribution could be financial innovation in terms of financial technology. Fintech is one of the industries of the future. It can do a lot to improve financial inclusion around the world. If done properly, it can contribute to sustainable finance, investment in green energy and green development. So there is a lot of positive. There's a big positive role and potential for the financial and professional services sector, for example, to play to help with inequality also internationally. Of course, the pandemic presents a major threat to inequality in this country. So potential for inequality growing both geographically and socially, and between minorities and majority population, and so on. And as Lizzie said, between generations as well. There are huge generational inequalities that are growing. But having said that, again, there are signs that the government is trying. So the furlough scheme was quite bold, and other fiscal policy, some other fiscal policy measures as well, quite bold on an by international standards. So there is a program to invest more in the north of England. So as long as it's helpful opportunities and entrepreneurs, rather than some kind of long bridges between, I don't know, Northern Ireland and Liverpool, I think this could have positive impacts as well. So I have a mixed attitude to that.
Okay. I think this follows on, thanks Derek. Rich Grenier has a question which I think follows on from what you've just said quite nicely. Rich, would you like to answer your question?
I will. I'll leave the video off if that's okay. Yeah, it's quite a simple one, really. I think it's fair to say that we live in closer to revolutionary times than we used to. It's been a while, in my experience, since people really have superglued themselves to the middle of London bridges. We have actual organised Nazis in the US. There are a variety of extreme positions being taken and have been taken over the last little while, and obviously COVID and post-COVID accentuates that. So the question I've got is really very simple. Is now a good time, possibly the best time of the last little while, to be a radical of some sort, or is it the worst time? It's tempting to say that all radical thought is capable of generating novelty, but also it often doesn't generate vaccines. So that's my question to the panel.
Who would like to start answer that one? Stefan, I can see your hand is raised. I can't. Yeah, why don't you kick off?
So just I think it's a great time to have radical thought. I'm not sure it's necessarily the best time to be radical, but we can argue about that. But this is a time for radical thought because there is much more openness to get new ideas, and that's, I think, why we need what is good about it. These kind of big crisis events, and also the recession that will continue after that. They're good moments to reconsider, but it's I leave it open whether it's the right time for revolution itself. I also just mentioning, because it's a typical thing to do with the mood of a time. We're all saying inequality has been rising. We actually, strangely enough, inequality after the financial crisis declined. Recessions are actually typical moments when actually inequality becomes lower, but it becomes more salient. And it's that saliency that makes it possible to have new ideas and to have change. So yeah, anyone with a great radical thought and maybe some radical action, it's a good time.
Depending on, obviously, yeah, with some caveats. Xavier has a question. Will nuclear power play a role in a sustainable post-COVID recovery? And I think that's probably directed at Lizzie. I don't know whether you want to ask the question or add anything more, or should we just get Lizzie to answer it?
I mean, yeah, just what got this on my mind. I don't know if you saw the story about an Extinction Rebellion activist has decided to leave Extinction Rebellion and become a nuclear power advocate. And she had spent her entire life being against it, and then she had this Damascene moment and said, oh, actually, this anti-nuclear feeling is getting in the way of my mission for a low carbon future. And just thinking about COVID and how much electricity has been key to keeping us all online, keeping us here, and all these big questions about the future, I'm just intrigued as to what Elizabeth thinks about the role of nuclear.
Yeah, so I think personally I would say that nuclear isn't the most cost-effective or speedy option for sustainable growth. I think one, it can be quite expensive, and two, it takes a long time to build. If you compare, I think it's something like an average of 7 years to build a nuclear power plant, even after it's got all the necessary approvals. Whereas you can put up a solar farm or a wind farm much quicker than that. And I think that when it comes to sustainability, we need to be doing as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And the other point is kind of economic cost, that it's really expensive, although it does provide greater scale and perhaps greater reliability. Personally, I don't think we've got kind of the time to not waste on nuclear power, but to make that a key part of the solution that we go for. Obviously, that will depend on different countries' capacities for solar, wind, but in the UK, we've got so much wind that we should be using a lot better than we are at the moment, would be my personal opinion, but other people have different ones. So. And maybe just on that, to answer Rich's point quickly, I think that one of the things that I really noticed at the end, or as COVID happened, towards the end of last year, just before COVID, there was a lot of activism going on around climate change, and even in Hong Kong as well. And actually, COVID lockdowns meant that died out. And I think we lost a lot of momentum in the climate change debate when Fridays for the Future and the youth strikes and Extinction Rebellion had to go online, and that kind of lost a lot of momentum. So I think it's quite a hard time to be radical in that sense, although Black Lives Matter is maybe starting to show that we're moving on from that. But also I think that there is a need to be radical in the fact that one of maybe perhaps the most dispiriting part of COVID has been the fact that even though economic shutdown happened, the drops in carbon emissions were noticeable, but they were only in the scope of kind of 8 to 10% worldwide. And we need 8 to 10% worldwide every year for the next 30 years if we're going to meet the Paris Agreement. So that suggests that we do need radical change.
Thank you. Great. There's a comment to end. I think we're going to move towards a close, and I wonder whether any of the panelists would like to say a final word before we end the session. No, I can't see any hands. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. The discussion has been excellent, and I'd love to continue. But thank you all. I mean, your expertise were phenomenal, and it's really great to hear all these different perspectives coming together, and actually with lots of commonalities about what is happening to the global economy, but also how we might move forward. So thank you very much. Thank you indeed, and thanks to the audience. And if you have the capacity, please clap, give it a little applause to our panelists. Thank you very much. And our next, I should announce, and I don't have the date, I think it's July the 17th, but please look out. We'll be having another of these Really Matters session. And this time it's going to be on SHAPE, which is the new initiative to address promoting the social sciences, the humanities, economics, and you know, in within schools and within society more generally. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, panelists.